Hi guys, I'm Judy Mohr and I'm a freelance editor with Black Wolf Editorial Services. I decided to do something special and start doing these little sessions about answering your questions, not things that I think you need to be answered, but what your questions actually are. Today we have a series of different questions that have come from a variety of different sources. So let's just get into it. Richard Morgan asked if there are any boutique publishers or agencies in New Zealand for publishing science fiction. The answer, in short, very quick, let's get to it, is not really. There are some publishers in New Zealand, and I'm going to put a link in the show notes below to where you can actually find the information about the publishers who work in New Zealand. But one of the things that you need to understand is that genre fiction is not very strong in New Zealand. The reason why is because the population is just doesn't, it's not big enough to support it. There are publishing houses in Australia who actually release books in New Zealand that you might be able to look at and might have a better target. But what you need to do when you're looking at publishers for, say, science fiction in particular, you need to look at who is your audience and where is the best place to go as a consequence. There are options available, but it all depends on what you want to achieve. Liz asked, after you finish your first draft and outline your rewrites, would I recommend that she rewrite the entire manuscript if it has big drastic changes, or would you go into the rough draft of the manuscript and try to get it all working? Well, if you're talking major changes, I'd be inclined to actually take the parts that you liked about your manuscript before and junk everything else. Start again. It's not because you need to just write everything again. It's because the connective tissue that you've written that goes from scene to scene will no longer work. So you need to think about what you have and what you don't have. There will always be little tiny sections from any draft that you just adore and you want to keep those and filter those through particular lines, particular statements, settings, various different aspects of that. But if you're talking major, drastic changes, sometimes starting from the beginning is what you need. Is it the best approach? I can't say, not without actually seeing the manuscript. Karen Stevenson asked if that she's about to send in a manuscript to run it through ProWritingAid, but then what next? Now, it's a bit hard to answer this question when I don't know what sending the manuscript in means, where it's going. But in general, if you are looking at going through an editor and those sorts of things, running your manuscripts through a program like ProWritingAid it's quite handy because it will pick up some of the things that you may have missed otherwise. In fact, ProWritingAid is one of the programs that copy editors do use to run and clean up some bits and pieces that they themselves may have missed. Grammarly, not so much. Most copy editors will actually say ProWritingAid is one of the better programs. Just keep that in mind when you're looking at these sorts of things. But some of the other things that I would definitely use before sending your manuscript off to someone is I would look at things like your crutchwords and run an edit for your crutchwords list. And those are words that you use frequently and you fall back on them. But I would also run your manuscript through what I call a was edit. A was edit is where you are deliberately hunting out words like was, is, were, and are. And you're looking at each instance and going, is that one needed? For example, you may have said, Jimmy was running through the field. Do you really need to use was running? Would Jimmy ran through the field be better? Sometimes you do want to just use the was. So you can't do a generic search and replace and just delete it because that doesn't work. But understanding whether you need the was can tighten your language, and it can really improve a manuscript and make it much more immediate in the way it's read. Over the past week, I've taken part in the Women in Publishing Summit, and it has been amazing. I am in information overload at the moment, and I'll probably at some point have like a summary of some of the key things that I've learned. But as part of the Women in Publishing Summit, I gave a presentation about writing deep point of view. If you look through my blog, you'll see some articles here and there about depth of perception. And there are some other YouTube videos about depth of perception as well. But with this presentation, I had some questions that were asked me, and I thought it might be an idea to answer those questions in a more public forum so everyone can benefit from the answers. A couple of the questions I was asked were about things like internal dialogue. Internal dialogue is part of going deeper into a character, but how they're formatted will depend entirely on what your narrative is. So if you're writing first person, technically all of your narrative is internal dialogue. So you wouldn't italicize anything or make anything special of formatting in those instances. But if you're writing third person, and you have constructed that sentence as a dialogue line, because that's the key thing. Internal dialogue is still dialogue. It's just dialogue that's said inside that nobody else can hear. It's like you're speaking to yourself or the cat or the dog. Yeah, nobody else can hear it. But those are lines that will be in italics if you're in third person, because they are definitely dialogue. But if you have like this thought that flows with the narrative, and it's constructed in such a way that it flows with the narrative too, then you don't italicize it. You leave it out. You leave it as just normal narrative construction. So it will depend on the way you've constructed those internal thoughts and how you've done that going deeper. I was also asked if there is such a thing as too much internal dialogue. The answer is yes, there is such a thing. Just like there's such a thing as too much dialogue. You can have such a big passage of nothing but dialogue, and you'll lose your reader because you have no idea what action or setting or what other things are going on. So you need to break up whatever dialogue form you're using, whether it's internal or external. You need to break it up with action. You need to break it up with setting. You need to break it up with the other things going on in your manuscript. And if you don't, your reader's lost. Keep them grounded. There was also the question about working with subtext within some of these dialogue lines. The example that the questioner had asked was the line from Godfather, "I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse." Yeah, if anybody's ever seen The Godfather with Marlon Brando, you'll know that that line is said by the mob boss. It's well-established character. So we know that when that line comes along, there's this subtext of, ooh, if the person doesn't accept the offer, what are the consequences? How is this guy going to die? Because it's a mob boss. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. But let's take that same line and let's put it with a character who's, say a female character who's getting all dressed up, ready to go out, putting on the push-up bra, the makeup, the lipstick, the high heels, the really, really slinky looking dress. And she knows she's going to be meeting the guy of her dreams at this nightclub or something. And she turns around and she says to her friends, "I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse." It's the exact same line, but because of the character, it carries a different subtext. And that's where deep point of view comes in. That's where understanding your character comes in. And that's one of the key aspects of writing deep point of view. If you are ever trying to write deep point of view, is to understand your character. If you do not understand your character, then you're going to have these lines that could have multiple meanings. But because the character isn't established, you don't have the subtext there. There was also a question about transitioning from nonfiction to fiction, particularly writing technical, scientific type stuff to writing fiction. For anyone who writes technical or scientific type papers, you'll know that the subjects, that you don't use the I, me, the we's, or anything like that, because it's the data that's important. It's the other constructions that are important. It's actually a very much a passive form of writing, even though people say it's not, it actually is. But what the biggest issue I found when I was moving myself from the nonfiction realm and into the fiction realm was the lack of contractions in my writing. I was so used to writing you cannot, will not, does not. I was so used to using that long form that when I went back and I looked at it, I was like, yeah, contractions. I need contractions. I need to start using contractions, a lot of contractions. The biggest advice I can give to anyone who is trying to make that transition is to read your work aloud. That's the best tool that anyone can have in their editing arsenal. Reading things aloud, you hear so many things. You hear when sentence constructions are like, not working, you're sticking the tongue, you're tripping over the words, and you need to just change the sentence because the sentence just doesn't flow. You read it out, you hear the punctuation, you hear where it's missing, and you're like, You'll hear the cadence in the sentence constructions. You'll start hearing things that are repeating, a repetitive pattern, and you can pick it up and make changes. And when it comes to dialogue, and dialogue in particular, you start to see a disconnect between what's actually written on the page and what's coming out of your mouth. Because what's coming out of your mouth is what should be on the page. One of the key things that I will do is I'll put on a little accent. I'll pretend I'm that character and I'll start saying their lines like they would. And I'll just be talking in whatever accent they have. And yeah, I start to hear the different constructions, the sentence, the orders of the words move around, and it changes the way I write that character. And it is the biggest trick I can have of any bit of writing. If you have a question that you really want to know the answer to when it comes to writing, editing, and perhaps maybe the publishing industry, then feel free to drop me a line. I'm going to put some links in the show notes below so you can go straight to the forums and just ask your questions. Do go to my website and check out all the resources that are there. There's a ton of information on the blog, as well as other resources available for writers just to download. As always, if you have any questions, you can catch me on Twitter, and that's at blackwolf_ed, or you can find me on Facebook, and that's Black Wolf Editorial, or you can check out my website, and that's blackwolfeditorial.com. If you have any interest in my personal writing, you can find information on that on my personal website, and that's judylmohr.com, or you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as Judy L. Mohr. I'll catch you next time, guys, and we'll answer those questions that you want the answers to. Bye.